I know self-publishing's not for everyone. Nothing is. But if you've considered self-publishing for even a minute, listen up, because I'm betting I know what's holding you back from exploring it further or getting started. Number one, you think the self-publishing process is a lot harder than it actually is. And number two, you're understandably afraid of doing it, air quote, wrong. So I've created a new free resource for you. It's called the Self-Publishing Starter Kit, and you can get instant access to it by clicking the link in the show notes or visiting publishaprofitablebook.com/self-publishing 101. In this free training, you'll discover the exact 4 steps to focus on and mistakes to avoid so you can publish an incredible book that's indistinguishable in quality from a New York Times bestseller without overthinking, overguessing, or overspending in areas that won't make a difference. Again, visit publishaprofitablebook.com/self-publishing 101 to get instant access. Welcome to the Write the Damn Book Already podcast. My name is Elizabeth Lyons. I'm a 6-time author and book editor, and I help people write and publish powerful, thought-provoking, wildly entertaining books without any more overthinking, second-guessing, or overwhelm than absolutely necessary. Because let's face it, some overthinking, second-guessing, and overwhelm is going to come with the territory if you're anything like me. I believe that story and shared perspective are 2 of the most potent ways we connect with one another, and that your story, perspective, and insights are destined to become someone else's favorite resource or pastime. For more book writing and publishing tips and solutions, and plenty of free and low-cost resources, visit publishaprofitablebook.com. And for recommendations of fabulous books you've possibly never heard of, book writing inspiration, and the occasional meme so relatable you'll wonder if it was created with you in mind, follow me on Instagram at Elizabeth Lyons Author. Okay, so this week we are going to tackle a few questions that I've gotten. I put lots of times a graphic in my stories on Instagram asking what questions people have and would like for me to tackle in the episodes, and I've collected 3. So let's just dive in. This will make this a quick episode, I think. The first one is, this is a question that comes up a lot actually. How do I manage/avoid copyright infringement? First of all, great question to ask. Second of all, very common question or concern to have. And third of all, please note, I am not an attorney, which means I'm definitely not an intellectual property attorney. But that being said, I have some suggestions and some guidance for people who are concerned about that. Copyright infringement or copyright overstepping happens more often in nonfiction than fiction for obvious reasons. When you're writing nonfiction and you are referencing back experiences that you've had or things that you've absorbed that have helped you get through something specific, lots of times you'll want to reference another book that you've read or a program that you took or a certification that you got. And the question comes up, well, how much can I say about that without getting into trouble with the creator of the original content? One thing I say often is that lyrics, so lots of times even when writing fiction, people want to put lyrics in their book. And with nonfiction, sometimes there's a song that has meant a lot to someone in the course of their journey, and they want to include the lyrics. Typically, I say this is not a good idea. Song lyrics it's one of the most litigious areas. So if you're going to get sued for something, that is pretty high on the list of things. There's really, if you think about it too, often not a reason to put the lyrics in the book. If you want to say, hey, I was listening to this song and the lyrics really grabbed me, if the reader is interested enough, they'll go look up the lyrics themselves. You can Google it readily and come up with lyrics with no problem. So to have to reprint them is usually not necessary, and it usually doesn't really support what you're doing enough to take the risk. But if you are going to do it, One of my authors, Corey Goodrich, in her memoir, Folk Song, A Ballad of Death, Discovery, and DNA, she did cite the lyrics from a particular song, and she got written permission from the producer and the songwriter and the singer and whoever held the copyright. She got permission to include those lyrics in the book. Unless the lyrics are in the public domain, which usually happens after the copyright owner has been deceased for a period of time, or the lyrics are just in the public domain because they are for some reason, I encourage people to stay away from lyrics. But whenever you're writing and you're including someone else's advice or guidance or principles, and you start to have pause about whether or not that's fair game for you to include, there's probably a reason why it's giving you pause. And the reason, there might be two sides of that. Number one is you might in fact be including material that is too much for you to use. There are some publishers who will say that if you use even one sentence, one portion of a sentence from a book without getting permission, you violated copyright. There are other publishers, and they'll want you to pay them for the ability to use those words or that sentence or that paragraph up front. It's usually pretty expensive. And for most authors, I again will say it's not worth it because you don't need to include all of it. You can certainly reference another book, or you can say, I attended this great program, or I listened to this great speaker, and reference that person. And then you're sending your audience to them. But one of my guiding principles is if you are including enough of someone else's work, whether it's their book or their research, for the reader to not need to look further into that other creator, you've probably overstepped copyright. And that is like a Liz rule. That's not even a hard and fast legal rule. That's just something to check on. But please know that even if you use a portion of another book, technically, you should be requesting permission from the copyright owner or the publisher. And in some cases, they'll give it to you. And in other cases, they'll say, yeah, we'll give it to you for a fee. And it's usually not, it can take a while, and it's not usually worth holding up the publication of a book over the use of that particular bit of information. So one of the more common things that I talk about with authors is when they're using a lot of someone else's information in support of what they're saying, you're in a defense position. So you're trying to prove, hey, my philosophy, my thought process is correct, put air quotes around correct. And the reason I know it's correct, I mean, if it's scientifically proven, it's scientifically proven. But if you're trying to prove an idea that you have and you're using someone else who's well-known or who has a lot of credentials and has proven themselves in the field to support the fact that you're correct, that's what you want to look at. I heavily encourage you to tell your story and share your experience. And when you come upon those moments of, oh my gosh, I think this might make me sound like a wackadoodle if I put this out there. And so therefore, I'm going to say, but hey, I know this is somewhat valid because so-and-so said this over here. Just observe what you're doing. Not from a place of judgment, but from a place of, oh, maybe this is an area where I'm not super comfortable yet or confident yet, just saying, this is my opinion on this. And certainly you can say, listen, I've read books by this person, and then I read this specific book, and I listened to this podcast, and all of them are referenced on my website or some such thing. But if you feel like you have to actually fill in content, in other words, you are creating word count by adding in a lot of someone else's words, that's when you want to take a pause. Because those words, I'm going to use the word should be yours, not someone else's. People are buying your book to read your experience, your insights, your expertise, your lessons. If they wanted to read Joe Dispenza or Gabby Bernstein or Brene Brown or Jen Sincero or anybody else, they'd buy their book. And remember, it's not your job to solve anybody's problem, and certainly not to solve it in full. So in all likelihood, someone will buy your book and they will take a piece of information. And if you think back to the books that you've read, you probably took a piece of information from one and a couple pieces from another and a few pieces from another and put it all together and developed your own opinion from which now you're writing this book, like coupled with your experiences. Remember that your reader is just looking for another piece to add to their brain, to add to the toolbox in their brain, to add to the way that they think about things and the way that they go about things and the experience that they have. And they don't have to agree with all or any of what you're saying in your book. In fact, them not agreeing with you is actually still them taking a step in the right direction, because by not knowing what you agree with, you move closer to what you do agree with. Worst case, if you get to the point where, you're ready to publish and you've included a lot or a little or some or any information that's already been published by someone else or been said or sung by someone else, you can certainly consult an intellectual property attorney and find out if what you've said is, over the line. When it comes time to do this, and most people find out what that kind of a consult will cost, they suddenly decide, well, maybe I don't have to say this. And then, or maybe I don't have to say this in this way or reference this person or this person's work. But then when they pull it back and they pull all that out, they realize they've lost 2,000 words. And that is a pretty big indicator that you've used way too much of someone else's work and not nearly enough of your own insights and experiences. So I hope that helps with that question. Another question I got is, why is publishing so complicated? And I ask myself this on the daily. But here's the thing. It's not. It's actually not. The actual act or process of book publishing is incredibly simple. It's just that everything around it is complicated. So the writing of the book is complicated for a whole slew of reasons. The marketing is complicated. The experience that you'll have with your publisher or as a self-published author or as an indie author, something like that can all be complicated because it's all different. And there are a lot of variables at play and there are a lot of different people involved. And so it feels complicated because it doesn't feel like there's a straight and simple path through any of it, because there isn't. Publishing, however, is not complicated. There's a series, I've always said, I wish there were a 10-step process for writing a great book. I wish there were a 10-step process for marketing a great book. There actually is, I don't know if it's 10 steps, but a step-by-step process for publishing a great book, regardless of who you're using, whether it's a traditional house or you're self-publishing. There are certain things that just have to happen. ISBNs have to be acquired, a cover has to be designed, the interior has to be formatted, back cover copy has to be written, a publishing house has to be assigned to it, and it needs to be uploaded to distributors. Now, within all of that, there are a lot of different questions that people have. Can I use a free ISBN? Please don't. Where can I get where do I register? What if I'm in this country? For example, Canada, in Canada, you get free ISBNs. So in the US, we have to pay for our ISBNs, but in Canada, you do not. It's probably also different over, in the UK. And I don't know what the rules are over there. I don't know if there are free ISBNs, but you can look into that. So that's why I believe it starts to feel complicated, because within each area, you can go really deep into the weeds of the process. But even still, it becomes, okay, what country, as a perfect, just as a simple example with ISBN, what country are you in? Okay, here's what you need to do. Here's where you get it. Here's what it will cost. Here's how you register it. And here's what that gives you. So once you are willing to, I think sometimes the thought that the publishing piece is really complicated is what keeps people from stepping in. So I get a lot of messages from people who say, I want to go traditional because there are just so many pieces involved, and editing and cover designer and typesetting and all these sorts of things, and I don't know how to do it. And no, you don't. But there are ways to find out either how to do it or whom to hire to do it that are quite simple. And so one of the things with traditional versus self-publishing or indie publishing that I've been talking a little more about recently is people will say, well, I think I choose traditional publishing. You can absolutely choose traditional publishing. It's important to recognize that traditional publishing might not choose you. So if you choose indie or self-publishing, you're controlling the vast, like that is an actual choice that you can make because you can make it and then execute it. Whereas with traditional publishing, you can prefer traditional, but now you've got to be willing and ready to go through the process of querying and submitting and being rejected and however long that takes. And sometimes it takes a lot longer than other times. And sometimes it gets really convoluted in the middle and toward the end and the whole thing. And that's fine. But when I hear people say, well, my choice is, it's not like going into a bakery and saying, well, these are your 3 cupcake choices. Which one do you want? And whichever one you choose, they're going to hand you and you're going to, hand them money and you get the cupcake. Traditional publishing also has to choose you. But once they do that, the actual act of publishing is predominantly the same. There may be a few little quirks here and there in terms of how different publishing houses distribute and who their distribution partners are and what the interiors of their book look like and what kinds of covers they prefer. But the nuts and bolts of the publishing process are simple. So that's why I'm so passionate about helping people to determine which publishing process do you want to pursue now. And then what's the next step in that process so that you can stop overthinking it and overanalyzing it and ruminating on it and get on with actually doing it and intentionally taking the next step and saying, okay, even though I've already gotten 15 rejections from agents, I choose, because this is where you can choose, to query another round. Or now I choose to pull back and do this differently. Or I self-published my first 3 books and now I choose to go through the process of trying to find an agent or going through a publishing house that accepts unagented submissions, that sort of thing. Not a vanity house, but an actual traditional house that either pays in advance or, because there's a lot of back and forth right now on what constitutes a traditional house. And many purists will say, it is only a traditional house if they pay in advance. That advance might be $1, but they technically pay in advance. There are other people who are a little more flexible who will say, as long as you aren't paying them up front, and they're giving you a better royalty split on the back end, that's still considered traditional. It's just more of what we would sometimes call a boutique traditional house. It's a smaller house that doesn't have 5 or 6 figures or even low 4 figures to give out a big advance up front, but they're willing to be more fair in their royalty split than a traditional publishing house would be. So the industry itself, I will admit, is getting a little more complicated, especially, even if you're on the inside and you spend all your days reading about it and talking about it. But for those on the outside, it definitely can feel like it's getting more convoluted and more complicated. And to a degree it is. But when it comes to the actual nuts and bolts, again, of step 1, step 2, step 3 of getting a book from edited to in people's hands, that process, that's the most simplistic piece of the entire thing. Okay, and final question for today. Why do I become an insecure mess when I sit down to write? I love this question because it's so honest. And it's so important to know that most people become an insecure mess when they sit down to write. Of course, you might have days where you're like, I've got this, I'm on this. And then you sit down and you become an insecure mess 7 minutes and 6 sentences later. But this is one of the biggest roadblocks for driven individuals. And when I say driven individuals, I mean people who know that in the past they were like, well, I want to know how to fix my dryer. So they go on YouTube and they watch a tutorial and they follow it and they fix their dryer. Or I want to know how to go to Costa Rica for a week. And so they go online and they look up all the things and they pick, people who execute well are often confused when they sit down to write a book and are like, I don't think this is for me. I'm not meant to do this. And the reasons are many. There are many, 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 many reasons it happens. It's certainly very personal to each individual why it happens. The key here, before working through it, which is something that people need to, we got to do that sort of on an individual basis because there is no one global, this is the solution. This is why you feel insecure. It's different for everybody. But one of the most important things to know up front is that you're not the only one who feels that way. It's amazing how if there were ever a silver bullet to solve this air quote problem, it would be this fact. Once you recognize that even 6-time authors, 12-time authors, New York Times bestselling authors often sit down to start the next book and feel insecure. All of a sudden, people go, oh, really? Because it's this misconception that you and we have about what it takes and what's required to write a good book. And then it's further the misconception that therefore we don't have that. So we can't write a good book. So please know that almost everyone I've talked to, and if you go back and you listen to any of the previous episodes of this podcast with authors who have sold thousands and thousands of books and have gotten 6-figure deals and are published with traditional houses and on and on and on, they all are honest enough to say the same thing, which is we all have days, if not weeks or months, where we're like, oh my God, I don't think I should do this. Like I've written 3 books, but maybe that's all I had in me. So whenever possible, find your group. Find a writing group. It doesn't have to be a paid group. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a meetup, a local meetup. Like I'm in Phoenix. We have multiple event. If you go on, what's the app? Like, I think it's called Meetup. And there are multiple local events in downtown Phoenix every single week or every other week where writers meet up and write. Some people just go into coffee shops. Some people go into parks, like whatever you need to do to feel like you're part of that community and to be reminded that everyone in that community is like, I don't know what I'm doing today. I got to this part of the plot and it doesn't even make sense. Like, where do I go from here? What if this happened? What if that happened? Does that even make sense? Every author, whether they're writing fiction, and when I say every, I don't mean to lump everyone together, but I really do believe it's like over 99% of the author population has a moment, whether it's the beginning or the end, where they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm feeling wildly insecure about this. What if this book isn't as well received as the previous book? The only difference is that the authors who have previously written a book know to expect it. And so they learn with each successive book how to deal with it better. The author who's on his or her very first book not only doesn't know to expect it, but doesn't know how to deal with it. And so once you know that it's actually a normal part of the process, it's a normal feeling to have, then you can realize that you're just like every other author out there, instead of thinking that you're not just like every other author out there and not in a good way. So I hope that was helpful. This might be the quickest episode I've ever done. You are always more than welcome to DM me any questions you have about the writing or publishing process, or you can email me, elizabeth@elizabethlyons.com. I will feature the answers on a future Q&A episode. I am now going to get back to my own writing, and I will talk to you again next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, this is your friendly reminder to follow or subscribe, leave a quick review, and share it with someone you know has a great story or message, but isn't sure what to do next. Also, remember to check out publishaprofitablebook.com for book writing resources and tips, and to see all the ways we can work together to get your book out into the world. Again, thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk with you again soon.